Again, good afternoon. My name is Bill Arnold, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Senior Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at Alma College, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Just want to say thank you for joining us, and we're going to get started in just a few minutes. But while we're waiting for a few others to get logged in, I want to let you know that we'll be keeping all the participants' microphones muted throughout the presentation. This helps prevent background noise and sound feedback in the system. If you'd like to communicate with myself or Dr. Montoye during the presentation, you can use the text chat feature. You can access this by clicking on the chat icon that appears on the bottom of your Zoom screen. The word chat with a little sort of thought bubble appears there. If you click on that, it'll open up a chat feature that you can send a message to the entire group, or you can direct it to me directly or individually, and I will be sharing those as they come up or at the end of the presentation. We will also be recording this presentation to share with all of you later, so you have a resource to go back to, and we'll also make it available to other alumni and friends of the institution. I would also ask that you do not use your video feature. There is an option to have folks have your video active, and I only ask that simply because it can appear on the screen and it gets distracting for others, as well as it expands the bandwidth, and that can make it difficult for others who are trying to stream the presentation. Again, my name is Bill Arnold, and I'm our Senior Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at Alma, and I'll be serving as the moderator as we get into this presentation. I just want to say thank you for joining us for this second series, part of our series in the Tartan Talks. This webinar is entitled Fitness Trackers, How and How Well Do They Work? And we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Alex Montoye as our presenter this afternoon. So in just a moment, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Alex and have him go ahead and get started with the presentation. Alex is an assistant professor here in our Department of Integrative Physiology and Health Sciences, where he focuses on clinical exercise physiology. He's an expert in the area of fitness trackers. It's a primary area of his research, and so we're really fortunate to have him here on campus and to be able to present this webinar for us. And so I really appreciate him taking time away from his summer research projects to be with us today. And Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you, and it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Bill, and thank you everybody for attending this webinar. I have four main things I want to focus on today. The first is the bottom bullet point, actually, which is just a very brief recap of what we know about why we want people to be physically active and what the benefits of that are. After that, I'll transition into what you're all here to hear about, which is fitness trackers. How do they work? How well do they work? How do we find out that information? And what, I guess, will be my take-home points on what can they or what should they be used for. So to get started, I would guess that most of you are aware that being active, exercising regularly is good for you. There are a lot of both short and long-term benefits from being physically active. This is just a small list of some of the main ones. This is certainly not a comprehensive list of all the positive benefits that can be accrued by being physically active. We see things such as a reduction in blood pressure, cholesterol, body weight. We see improvements in your lean body mass, so increased bone and muscle mass. And we also see better mental health, whether that's lowered stress, lowered depression, higher self-esteem, etc. Those can happen in the short term and long term, and they also do lead to decreased disease risk over time. Many different chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, osteoporosis, certain types of cancer, just to name a few. Again, this list is not comprehensive by any means. Because of that, there are many different organizations that recommend physical activity. Our government, the Department or U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, recommends that adults achieve or strive to achieve at least 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity activity. Moderate intensity activity is defined as anything that increases your heart rate noticeably, causes you to breathe harder than you normally would. It's the equivalent of about a brisk walk would be kind of the minimum threshold for what would count as aerobic or moderate intensity physical activity. If you're active at a higher intensity, vigorous intensity, you can do a little bit less. You can get 75 minutes a week in order to achieve recommendations. We also see recommendations such as achieving 10,000 steps per day, 300 calories a day during exercise. Those are alternate ones that are used sometimes by organizations. You'll see that fitness trackers a lot of times will have a steps per day goal. And so we'll just keep that in mind as we go through this presentation as well. Now, according to that top recommendation, different researchers have surveyed the U.S. population to see how active people are, right? How many adults are actually achieving this physical activity recommendation of 150 minutes per week. Surveys come back that a little bit over half of adults report meeting physical activity recommendations. It's about 52 or 3% for males and about 51% for females. So just over half report meeting recommendations. However, if you actually measure their activity levels, this is a study done about 10 years ago now by Troiano, looking at physical activity levels assessed by accelerometer or activity monitor in the adult population. You can see they split it out into males, females, and then a total here. And they also split it into age groups. So one of the big take-homes from their study was that physical activity levels decrease substantially with age, beginning even in young or relatively young children. Physical activity levels decrease substantially. You can see here on the right side of the screen, though, that the story is very poor when it comes to adults as far as achieving physical activity recommendations. About 5% or so of adults meet that 150 minutes a week guidelines. So despite the fact that physical activity is good, we know it's good, most people are not active enough. With that, I want to transition to the main part of this talk then, which is activity monitors. What are they? There are a lot of different names that get used to describe activity monitors. Things like fitness trackers, activity trackers, Fitbands, wearables are in general all referring to pretty much the same thing. It's a device you would go out and purchase. It's going to track some basic fitness metrics that we'll talk about here in a couple slides. Different monitors have different metrics that they track, but generally this is what people are talking about, a way to track in real time what your activity levels are, and ideally also be able to set goals that you can strive for on a daily or a weekly basis. There are a number of brands of physical activity trackers. Popular ones would include brands such as Fitbit, which is the most common activity monitor brand. Apple Watch is a big player in the market now. Garmin has a number of different fitness trackers outside of their normal GPS technology that would fit into this market. Misfit, Jawbone are a couple other of the fairly big players. A company over in Asia called Xiaomi is actually the second biggest one in the world because they have a substantial market over in Asia. So there are a lot of different companies putting out a lot of different monitors. They range in price, they range in accuracy, they range in the types of metrics they assess. And so I'm going to try to summarize who owns these devices and then what they're used for and how well they work. So to start off, who owns activity trackers? This is a little bit of an old statistic now. This is from 2013, breaking out the types of individuals who are likely to get an activity tracker. You can see that generally younger people are more likely to own activity trackers. You can see these age groups are the highest represented, but even a substantial number of middle-aged or older individuals also own activity trackers, and I believe the numbers are higher now in those categories than they were before. So it's pretty evenly distributed across the population. In terms of how many devices are actually sold, The numbers for all monitors isn't known. However, you can track single companies, or there are statistics available for single companies. So I pulled Fitbit monitors because Fitbit was really the first company that came out with these consumer wearables. They're also, at least as of last year, the most popular brand in the world. So this chart shows the number of Fitbits sold in millions worldwide. So this isn't the US, it's worldwide. You can see the company started in about 2008, 2009. So it's about 10 years old. Since then, you can see an exponential rise in the number of trackers sold up until 2016. Actually, 2017 was the first year they saw a dip in the market. And not really sure why that is exactly. We expect it's because there are other companies like Apple who have really taken a lot of market share from Fitbit. We also think that Fitbit, anybody that wants a Fitbit has one, or not anyone, but a lot of people that have them want or already have them. So they don't need to buy another one yet, which is why you see Fitbit putting new products on the market now to try to increase their sales back. But regardless, you can see the numbers that we're looking at. You're talking about 20+ million monitors of just one brand sold worldwide. So a lot of people use these devices. There was a statistic from 2015. So again, this is old and it's probably an underestimation, but the estimation was about 1 in 10 Americans use an activity tracker of some kind. So the number is probably higher than that now. So we're talking about a lot of people that use these devices. As far as how they work, there's one device or sensor that's in virtually all of these devices that is able to pick up movement and then translate that into the meaningful metrics we're interested in, such as steps or calories or distance covered, that kind of thing. The main sensor in these devices is called an accelerometer. It is sensitive to orientation of a device as well as changing in movement patterns. So the way I like to think about this is if you have a smartphone and you switch from portrait to landscape orientation, your phone automatically knows that change happened and adjusts the screen so you're still looking at the correct orientation of the picture. That is an accelerometer that is the sensor in your phone that allows the phone to know its location in space and also what the changes are. So the activity trackers use the same kind of technology, the accelerometer sensor. Some more sophisticated sensors also have things like a gyroscope. Some have GPS for navigation. Some have an altimeter, so they can detect changes in elevation as people move. Another big sensor people are interested in is the heart rate function. It's relatively new that we've been able to detect heart rate via the wrist. Historically, we've needed like a chest tracker or an EKG type setup to be able to get heart rate. So the idea that you can get heart rate from the wrist is an exciting possibility. And then we've also seen things tested such as skin temperature, to get an idea of exercise intensity. So there's a lot of different sensors, but again, the main two are going to be the accelerometer, which is in virtually all devices, and then some which also contain a heart rate monitor as well. Okay, so as far as the metrics, I've kind of mentioned a few of them so far. Most activity trackers, at least initially, so the Fitbit monitors and such, are set up to detect your main health-related variables. How many steps do you take? How many calories do you burn? How many active minutes do you get? Active minutes would refer to as minutes of at least a moderate intensity. So minutes that would count toward those Department of Health and Human Services recommendations. What's your heart rate? How's your sleep? Both how many hours are you sleeping and what's the quality of the sleep that you're getting? How much distance are you traveling and how many flights of stairs are you climbing? So those, again, all with a health focus, looking at those different health aspects. Some new monitors, which I won't discuss really in this talk, but just wanted to make you aware. There have been in the last 3 or 4 years a proliferation of sport-specific monitors, devices that are set up to detect things like swing speed, whether it be a baseball bat or a tennis racket or a golf club, jump height, resistance training, sprinting. There are a lot of different monitors that are used for those more sport-specific contexts. So that may be of interest to you. If it is, I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but I'll be focusing on the more traditional metrics, both because it's a health focus and because far more people use those types of devices than the sport-specific ones. As far as how these monitors are used, obviously we're tracking these metrics that I just talked about. There are two main areas, though, one being surveillance. So that refers to, can we get an idea of how active people are? That might be me as a researcher saying, how active are freshmen at Alma College when they get here? Are they more active, or do they become more active in their time here? Do they become less active? Are they less active in the winter? And could that be contributing to maybe higher incidence of mental health issues or lower grades in class? That kind of thing. Once we can know about someone's activity patterns, we have the opportunity then to make change. If we find that there's certain groups of individuals that maybe aren't as active as we'd like them to be, can we intervene in that population? Can we help them set goals? Can we give them feedback? Can we design competitions or find other ways of motivating these individuals to increase their activity levels? So we can both see how active people are, and if we determine that that activity level needs change, we can try to change it. Okay, so with that, I want to get into activity monitors specifically as far as what we know about them, how well they work, that kind of thing. The first graph I wanted to show you is kind of, I made this graph myself. It's a accuracy versus cost trade-off with devices. There's a perception that if you buy a very expensive monitor, it's probably going to be more accurate, whether that's for whatever metrics you're looking at, steps, calories, etc. That's not the case. There is a certain threshold below which, if you buy a very, very inexpensive monitor, it's probably not going to track very well. But if you buy a monitor from any of the major companies, so again, Fitbit, Garmin, Jawbone, Apple, the accuracy is going to be very similar on the devices, and the accuracy is going to be similar across models within a certain brand. So if you buy the cheapest Fitbit monitor or the most expensive Fitbit monitor, there's not going to be a whole lot of variation in quality or accuracy. And so most Fitbit monitors start at about $100, which is why I have that kind of as the inflection point, where beyond that, you don't really gain a whole lot as far as accuracy of the device goes. However, with more expensive monitors, typically you do get increases in the number or types of variables that can be assessed with the device. So for example, the cheapest Fitbit monitor at $100 can measure steps, calories, distance. It doesn't have a heart rate sensor. So if heart rate is of interest to you, you're not going to want to purchase that sensor because it's not going to give you what you need. The Fitbit Charge, HR, which is the one of the Fitbit models that does detect heart rate, is about $150, and that does, again, that gets you your heart rate data. And so you get more variables that you can assess, but you have to pay for that in order to get that. If you want a GPS watch, the number goes up still further. So if you want a Garmin that has GPS, or you want Apple that has GPS, you're going to be paying in the $200 to $400 range. So you get more. If those variables are of interest to you, that might be an option you want to consider exploring. I'm going to go through two summary slides now. One is a summary of what we know about these devices in terms of how accurate they are. The next one then is a summary of what we know in terms of, do they actually get people to change their behavior, right? If I purchase a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, will it make me healthier? We have information or data on both of those. And then the last thing I'll finish with then is an example study that we did here at the college last summer that aims to answer some of these questions. So as I get into the summary of how accurate these devices are, I should say that these devices are all proprietary in the way they take your movement data and translate them into steps or calories or heart rate. In other words, we have no idea how the movements that you do, what algorithms or what models are put in place to translate that into the meaningful outputs like steps or calories. So we can't change that. Like, we can't make a Fitbit monitor better by testing it, but what we can do is we can at least understand how it works. What types of variables does it assess well? What types of variables does it not assess well, etc. So in that research, we found that in general, these devices have higher accuracy for measuring steps than they do for measuring calories. Calorie function in these devices is very poor. Errors in calorie prediction have been anywhere from about 10 to 70 or 80%, depending on the monitor and the study. In some studies, it's overestimation, and some it's under. But again, in general, very, very high error for prediction of calories. Steps works pretty well for walking and running activities especially. So if you're interested in tracking those types of activities, the steps recorded by the monitor will be very good. However, if you're into things like cycling, if you walk and push a stroller, if you're walking the door pushing a shopping cart, accuracy will be lower, especially if you're wearing a wrist-mounted device, because if the device isn't moving, if you're not swinging your arm there's no way to detect that activity is actually happening. So that's what these top 2 points are kind of referring to.
Alex,
third point, yeah.
Alex, this is Bill. There's been a question presented related to calories. And the question is, how do you measure calories expended from exercise?
How can an individual do it, or how do we do it in the lab?
I'm assuming maybe both, if you can quickly.
Sure. So I guess, and I probably should have mentioned this, when we're doing an accuracy study, when we're looking at how well a device works, we have to have some true measure, right? How many steps did I really take? How many calories did I really burn? What is my actual heart rate? To know if these devices, the output coming from these devices is close or is it not? So in the lab, to measure steps, we just have somebody count steps. Pretty simple, it's boring, but it works. For calories, we need a lot more sophisticated equipment. So we have a machine called a metabolic cart. What it does is it's a mask that you wear, and it measures all the air that you're breathing in and out. The idea being that calories are a measure of heat, but it also uses oxygen. And so if we can measure how much oxygen your body is using, then we know exactly how many calories you're burning. So an example might be we'll bring someone in the lab, we'll put this metabolic analyzer on them, we'll put the Fitbit monitor on them, and we'll have them walk for 10 minutes at 3 miles an hour. At the end of those 10 minutes, the Fitbit will give us a certain number of calories. At the end of those 10 minutes, we'll use the metabolic analyzer data to determine how much oxygen was used, thereby allowing us to know exactly how many calories were burned. And then we'll compare the true value to the predicted value from the monitor. So hopefully that helps to answer the question. Okay, for, I guess, getting back to talking about heart rate, the wrist tracking of heart rate is actually pretty good. Most studies show that errors are 5% or so or less, meaning that if a monitor tells you your heart rate's 100 beats a minute, it's probably between 95 and 105 most of the time. There are certain situations, though, in which the heart rate tracking doesn't work quite as well. In people that have poor circulation to their arms, so the monitor, the heart rate sensor in the device has to have adequate blood flow going through the wrist. So in very cold weather, if you have poor circulation to the hands, or if you're just an individual who has poor circulation, the heart rate may not work as well. The other time where it doesn't work as well is if you don't have the monitor securely fastened to the wrist. So if there's a lot of movement, it's going to be hard or difficult for that sensor to work correctly. So typically you see those, the issues with movement of the device in higher intensity exercises. So some studies have shown that the heart rate function works really well at rest. It works well when you sleep. It works well when you're doing low intensity activities. But if you were to go out for a run and you're sweating a lot and the monitor starts to get loose, it may not work quite as well. So it's just something to keep in mind with the heart rate. But for most of the brands, for Fitbit, Apple, certainly, the heart rate function from those works pretty well overall. Last point at the very bottom is that so researchers have used activity monitors similar to the Fitbit or the Apple Watch for decades. They became popular really in the 1980s. Traditionally, these devices have always been placed on the center of the body, so either the chest or the hip, because the idea is that if the center of your body is moving, the rest of your body is also moving. Whereas with the wrist, early studies showed that the wrist was a very poor placement site because you can move your wrist without moving the rest of your body, right? I can be sitting in a chair, typing on my computer or shuffling files, and your wrist would detect that as a lot of activity even though you're not really burning any energy. So for optimal accuracy of the device, we actually do advocate that people, if you want the best accuracy, put it in your pocket or something like that rather than wearing it on the wrist. For devices that have heart rate, obviously that doesn't work. But for if your steps or calories is your primary measure you're interested in, you might consider that. Even though, again, it's not really designed to be worn there, it'll probably be more accurate overall. So that's a quick summary of accuracy data then, and I'm happy to answer further questions if there are any. The second thing I wanted to do then was talk about lifestyle change. Does wearing a monitor influence your behavior? The answer is yes for some people. We see that increases in physical activity, sometimes as much as 25 to 30%, are achievable. We do see losses in body weight in general in individuals who wear these devices, at least in the short term. So most of these studies don't go past about 6 months or so, but we can say at least preliminarily that these devices do seem to increase activity as well as help people lose body weight in the short term. We don't know if this persists, right? Does the novelty wear off, or if the monitor breaks after 9 months? Are the lifestyle changes you made sustainable? Or if you're not getting the feedback anymore, will you just revert back to what you were doing before? There are studies that are starting to look at that. However, we don't have a lot of data yet to know what the long-term implications of wearing a device are. We do know that these devices are not effective for everybody. It makes it a little bit hard with this research because there are people that will not be motivated by the devices, whereas there will be people that will be motivated. So we can't just give these to everyone and expect everyone to make improvements in health. It really comes down more to, is this something that's going to motivate you in a positive way? If it is, it's something that you might consider using to help improve health. One last recommendation I'd have in this category then is not to scale the number of calories you consume based on what the calories from your activity tracker report. There have been some indications that in people that do that, these devices tend to overestimate how many calories you burn. So if you eat according to what the devices are saying you're burning, you may actually gain weight over time. So it's counterproductive using the calorie function from these devices to know how much you should be eating. Last thing then is I just wanted to go through real quick a study from our lab in which we were interested in how the heart rate function affects calories. We know that the calorie outputs from these devices are really bad. They have huge errors overall. And so we set up a study to try to figure out how do calories get predicted from these devices, and are there ways to try to make it better? And so this study was recently published in the Journal for the Measurement of Physical Behavior. It was 3 students here at Alma College and I who conducted this study. And what we did was we brought 23 individuals into the lab, and we had them do 9 different activities while wearing 5 different Fitbit activity monitors. So you can see this guy here. He's actually our strength conditioning coach here at the college, volunteered to be in the study. And we put 6 monitors, but only 5 Fitbits. So I'll just tell you what we found about the Fitbit. 3 monitors on each arm, and we had them do a variety of different activities in the lab. What we did with this study was we set it up to where 3 of these devices, 3 of these Fitbit monitors recorded heart rate, and 2 of the devices did not record heart rate. So what we were interested in is, in the devices with heart rate, does that make calorie prediction better? You'd expect that it would, because heart rate is dependent on the intensity of activity. And so if the device has information about both how much movement you're getting and what your heart rate is, it should be able to derive a better calorie prediction. I'm just going to show you 2 activities that we set up for these devices. So we had them walking at 3.2 miles an hour, both at a 0% grade, so that's on a flat treadmill. And then we also had them walking 3.2 miles an hour on a 10% grade. The reason we set up the activities like this was we wanted the number of steps from the monitors to be identical or very close, because we figured if the steps were the same but the heart rate wasn't, would that affect calorie burn? If the devices only were sensitive to steps taken, the number of calories would be exactly the same between the 2 trials, even though the 10% grade is a harder activity. However, if the monitors were sensitive to heart rate and heart rate increased at the 10% grade, you'd expect to see an increase in the number of calories reported by the device. So this first slide, what I have listed, the criterion is our true measure of steps taken. And then we have our 5 monitors listed out here. These 3, the Blaze, Charge HR, and Alta HR, are all the heart rate monitors, or the Fitbits that have heart rate. And then our Alta and Flex 2 are the monitors that don't. This first graph just confirms what we wanted to do, which was not change steps between the 2 walking trials. You can see both the criterion and all of these 5 monitors. This number of steps taken was very similar when they were walking on flat ground to when they were walking on level ground. The second slide then shows the heart rate. shown both by the criterion measure and all three of the devices that measure heart rate at these two activities. So you can see the 10% grade was harder, is shown by an increased heart rate by the criterion. You can see almost 40 beats per minute increase, excuse me. You can see all three of our Fitbit monitors also accurately detected this increase. The heart rate was pretty close to the criterion, both at the level walking as well as the inclined walking for all three devices. So with that in mind, we expected the calorie counts to be higher at the 10% grade for all three of these devices, whereas for the two devices not assessing heart rate, we expected the calories to be about the same. And that's what this slide shows then. This is the last slide from this study. The true number of calories increased substantially. You can see it went from about 25 calories during the 5-minute walk to almost 50 calories at the 10% grade for 5 minutes. You can see all three of our monitors with heart rate did increase the number of calories. So the devices were sensitive to both the heart rate and the movement data. However, you can see from this that during the level walking, these three devices with heart rate dramatically overestimated the number of calories burned. You can see all of them were well over 40 calories when the true number was only 25 calories. At the incline, they were better, but they were still overestimating calories overall. In contrast, our two devices without heart rate, the Ulta and the Flex 2, they didn't change their calorie prediction from activity 1 to activity 2. Again, they didn't have heart rate data, so because the movement data was very similar, their prediction of calories was very similar. So they overestimated at the level ground, they underestimated during the inclined walk. So we expected these three monitors to be better. We found that they were responsive. However, the average error for calorie prediction was about 25 to 30% across all 5 devices, and it was not better for the 3 devices with heart rate compared to the 2 devices without heart rate. Okay, that wraps up the planned talk that I had. I did have one specific question that was sent before the webinar, and so I added a slide about the Apple Watch just with some general information about it. And then if there are other questions, I'm happy to answer those as well after this one. So just to give some information about the Apple Watch, on the Apple website, it costs $329 to purchase, so it's definitely on the higher end for cost with activity monitors. With that, you get things like GPS, you get heart rate measures, you do get synchronization with your smartphone, so you can receive text messages. I think you can play music on the newest version of the Apple Watch. So if those features are of interest to you, they're certainly available on this, where they wouldn't be with a lot of the other devices. As I mentioned before, Apple is one of the devices that has high accuracy for steps and for heart rate measurement. And then also it has those added features such as syncing with the phone for texts and calls, etc. The limitations, though, with the Apple Watch, the cost obviously is one. It's among the most expensive activity trackers. The battery life is a big limitation. It only lasts about 24 hours, so you have to charge it every day, in contrast to things like the Fitbit monitors typically last 5 days or so. The Garmin monitors will last about 2 weeks unless you're using GPS, so it's a lot less charging that you have to do. And also the monitors with heart rate sensors are a lot bigger, so it's both thicker and wider. It needs to be wider so you can read text and those kinds of things, but if you're looking for a small monitor, the Apple Watch would not fit or would not work so well for you. All right, with that, I'm happy to take any other questions. Bill, did you have any that came in?
Yep, we did. A couple of questions coming in. So one of those is if 2 people are wearing the same traditional device to count steps and are wearing the device in the same position on their body, will the step counts be similar for the 2 individuals? Or will there be variables based on maybe body size or those types of things?
Right. So they will work with similar accuracy. If the individuals have a similar stride length, then you could expect the number of steps those individuals take will be very similar. Right. If you have 2 different people, though, let's say you have a tall person, your stride length is dependent on your height. So the taller someone is, the longer their stride. The number of steps you'll take, a taller person will take for a mile, let's say, will be less than the number of steps a shorter individual will take. So that is one thing that's a little bit unfair about the 10,000 steps per day recommendation, and that if I have a long stride length, I actually walk a lot further before I hit 10,000 steps than if I have a shorter stride length.
Also, a question about the difference between just sort of steps and that 10,000 versus the pace of those steps. And obviously, I think that potentially gets to calories. But in terms of monitoring that, do the monitors, any of the fitness trackers, have a gauge to help indicate an ideal sort of pace for those steps?
That's a great question. Yeah. So the steps per day, and let's say the 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, those are not assessing the same thing. Moderate intensity activity is much more meaningful, I guess, as far as unless you walk a lot in your job, let's say, you're probably not going to get the 150 minutes without planning some kind of an exercise routine, whether that's a walk or a run or something like that. Steps you can accrue during all kinds of things. You can do it during chores, you can do it during exercise. So the monitors, some of the monitors, like Fitbit, for example, has a variable they call active minutes. That variable is meant to be a surrogate for that moderate or greater intensity activity. So it tracks the rate of stepping that someone's doing, and if you step at a certain rate, it counts it as active minutes, and if you don't, it won't count it. So if you were doing chores all day, let's say, and you were getting lots of steps but not at a certain pace, you'd probably see on the monitor at the end of the day that you'd have a high step count, so you may achieve your 10,000 steps per day. However, you wouldn't achieve that active minutes goal, which I think the default is 30 minutes a day that they want you to hit of those active minutes. So you might hit one recommendation but not the other. That would be one way that the devices can give you an idea of the pace of your steps or the intensity of the activity you're doing.
And then you mentioned earlier that some of the devices have a feature to monitor sleep quality, and just a question about how do they actually do that, if you could summarize that quickly.
That's a great question. So that's actually a study we did in our lab last summer also, along with the heart rate study. So so I guess it's similar to steps or similar to calories, I guess. The devices that are most simple, so if we took a Fitbit Flex or a device that doesn't have heart rate monitoring, the only way it can detect whether you're sleeping or not is by movement of the wrist and the time of day. It takes that into account as well. So if you're a type of sleeper that doesn't move a whole lot, the device works pretty well for telling how long you've been asleep. The more sophisticated monitors, to the ones that do have heart rate technology, use that in the prediction of sleep. The idea being that certain stages of sleep, you have a different heart rate, and when you're asleep, your heart rate's lower than it is when you're awake. So some of the devices with heart rate then incorporate that to try to improve measurement. Some devices even have a skin temperature sensor. We know that there's a correlation between your skin temperature and whether you're asleep or not. So the more sophisticated monitors, at least theoretically, should be better at measuring sleep. Overall, what we see, though, is that the devices, they tend to work pretty well for total sleep time. So the amount of time you're in bed, they track pretty well because, you get in bed, your movement's likely going to be pretty minimal. And so it can track that fairly well. What it doesn't track well, though, is the sleep quality. So number of times you wake up in the night, unless every time you wake up you get out of bed to go to the bathroom or to get a glass of water or whatever. It can track those, but if you wake up and then you just lay in bed, it's going to miss that sleep awakening. It also does pretty poorly at measuring sleep stages, so knowing if you're in REM sleep or deep sleep or light sleep. Again, if all they can rely on is movement of your wrist, it's going to be pretty limited in its ability to accurately determine those metrics.
Okay, great. We have a little more detailed question here, and it mentions a study that was done at UCSF regarding their Deep Heart. It said, can you speak to the future of fitness trackers with regard to identifying or even diagnosing diseases?
Okay. Yeah, so there's some really interesting research. I think I know the lab that the question's referring to out in California. Given that San Francisco is right in the thick of Silicon Valley, there are a lot of startup companies that are trying to use wearable technology beyond just how many steps are you getting, how many calories you're burning, but answering questions such as, can we tell when someone has a heart attack by the data that's coming in on their wrist? Or can we tell? The one that's most relevant, I think, is looking at atrial fibrillation, which is a disease in the heart. It's kind of transient, so you can go in and out of this condition. When you're in the condition, it really debilitates you. It increases your chance for heart attack. When you're out of the condition, you can function more or less normally. And there are some very interesting applications where people have used it's all been on the Apple Watch so far, because Apple makes it possible to use or develop apps for the phone that can communicate with the watch. And so there have been companies that have developed these apps and actually use the heart rate data to tell if people are in atrial fibrillation or not. And they're pretty accurate. I can't give you a specific number, but they are pretty good at pinpointing or not pinpointing, but determining when people are in atrial fibrillation or not. And also for people that may have gone to the doctor's office with chest pain or something, but you get to the doctor's office and you're fine, what the doctors can do is they can give you an Apple Watch, and then they can remotely detect or track heart rate activity and look for signs of something like atrial fibrillation. So yeah, there's some very interesting potential that way for that disease. There's one I know of that is using wearable technology to try to look at blood glucose levels on a continuous basis. So that would be very relevant for people diagnosed with diabetes, learning how to better treat that and monitor blood sugar levels, as well as trying to determine if someone's diabetic or not over time. So that's been another really interesting one that has a lot of important health implications if they can get that technology working reliably and then scale that to where it's used on a wider basis than just in that lab. So yeah, some really, really cool possibilities for using wearable technology in those circumstances.
Terrific. Another question that came in is related to the accuracy of step counts. And the question is, should a monitor be placed on someone's dominant hand? Do they get a better read? Does it matter if it's on your dominant hand? Say if I'm right-handed, should I wear it on my right hand or my left hand? Does it matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is we don't have a consensus overall. At first, when these devices were worn, everybody advocated wearing them on the non-dominant wrist, actually, because it's been shown that if you wear it on the dominant wrist, you pick up more activity than on the non-dominant wrist, to the point where they thought it overestimated your activity levels overall. There seems to be some indication, though, that if you don't wear it on your dominant wrist, you're going to miss some really important activities, right? So if I went out and I played tennis and a monitor was worn on my non-dominant wrist, I'm missing all this meaningful movement data that I would capture if it was on my dominant wrist. Or when you're doing household chores, you typically do more with your dominant wrist. So the answer is yes, it definitely affects physical activity estimates. If you want to get a higher activity level, putting it on your dominant wrist will give you feedback that you're doing more. But we don't know if that actually makes it better or not. So unfortunately, I can't give you a definitive answer other than we do know it does change physical activity output from the device. Doesn't seem to change sleep output, though, so that one's less important. But the activity, what you get through the day, matters.
Great. One final question I've seen is related to, we've talked a lot about steps, but obviously a lot of people use bikes or cycling types of machines for exercise.
Yep.
Does it, if you have it in your pocket while you're doing that type of exercise, how accurate is the reporting?
It's a good question. So it's going to depend a little bit on the device. What I've found is that it tracks pretty closely. So if you put it in your pocket and you're cycling, it tracks pretty closely with your cadence. of cycling. So if your cadence, that's your revolutions per minute that you're turning the pedals. For example, if your cadence was 70, it would give you about 70 steps a minute. If your cadence is 100, it'll give you about 100 steps a minute. So if you're cycling for an hour at 100 cadence of 100, excuse me, it would give you 6,000 steps. That is, if you were to look at like the calories burned during an hour of cycling, it's going to be substantially more probably than walking. So in terms of the amount of steps it gives you, it's not really enough to compensate for what you did. But at least it's better than giving you no steps. If you put it in your pocket, or I've seen some people put it on their ankle to be able to track that activity. So yeah, it'll give you something. It won't give you the credit you deserve for the amount of activity that you did. Some of the applications, though, will factor that in. So for example, with Fitbit, if you plug in that you cycled for 30 minutes, it actually has a step conversion that it will add to your daily step total. So if you took 6,000 steps today, but you also rode your bike for 30 minutes, if you input that in the app, it'll give you credit for that at a certain rate, whether it's 100 steps a minute or 200 steps a minute. It depends on the exact activity, but it will give you credit that way.
Great. So I have not seen any other questions come in. If there are other questions at this point, we'll just pause here and ask if anybody has a question to please send that in.
Yeah, and while we're waiting, Bill, I guess I'd like to just give one final recommendation or thought on these. It's really easy to do these research projects and find, wow, you know, the Fitbit doesn't work well for counting calories, or it's easy to kind of bash on these monitors because overall it misses a lot of the activity that people do. However, I think there's a lot of benefit with these technologies. It certainly makes you more aware of how active you are. It gives a nice indication on when you get your activity, right? Do you get steps at work or not? Do you get most of your activity in the morning or the evening? Are your weekends much different than your weekdays as far as how much activity you get? About how much do you sleep, right? These numbers aren't perfect, but being aware, at least generally, of how active you are, how well you're sleeping, how many calories you're burning is really, really valuable information. And it's vital if you're going to make a change and know that you're changing in a positive direction. So I wouldn't say take these numbers as, you know, I have to get 10,000 steps a day on my Fitbit, because that number is probably not right. But if when you start wearing the device, you're taking 4,000 steps a day, and a month later you're up to 7,000 or 8,000, you've made a really positive and meaningful lifestyle improvement, and you should see health improvements that come along with those.
Great. So it certainly is obviously a tool to help us each be a little more accountable to ourselves and our goals.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you again, Alex, for sharing this great information. I think it really gives us some insights for those of us that maybe don't have a fitness tracker yet, or even those of us who have one and have been thinking about it. And so, again, this is really useful information, and I found it very, very interesting, and appreciate you taking time again to share this with us.
And thank you, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for everyone who's joined in. And please, if you have further questions, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call at the contact info here. I love this stuff. I wear a couple different monitors, so I'm happy to talk about my personal experiences or more about what the research shows as well.
Okay, great. Thank you again for everybody for joining us, and we will share the recording of this with you as soon as we have it downloaded and cleaned up a little bit, and in a usable format. We will send it to all of you that shared your email addresses with us. Thanks, and have a great day.